My name is Brittany Acquaviva. I have had the amazing opportunity of going ahead and presenting to y'all today. So, thank you again for the invitation. I was talking to my husband, one of my bigger goals is just to continue to be an active participant with the community of all of us that are passionate about this topic, but also all of us that are actively working very hard in this field. And so I am very, very excited to be here and just very honored to have even be asked. So for this presentation, I went ahead and put together some more recent research projects using some primary data that I have been really fortunate enough to collect myself through the course of my career. And so with that, let's see, to give you some context, I'm actually originally from the Midwest. I got my bachelor's in criminal justice sciences and psychology from Illinois State University. And then I went on and I got my master's from Illinois State as well. For some reason, I just kept going. I didn't want to give myself a break. And so I went and right after I got my master's, went into a PhD program at Sam Houston State University in Texas. At the time of my admission, they were the number 3 or 4 criminal justice doctoral program in the country. And so from somebody who was a first generation college student, my mom and dad both did not finish high school. That is a very proud sort of badge of honor that I kind of hold and being able to say that, it was really hard and I got there and I did it. So I'm very proud of that. And then I was very lucky to go ahead and get a job right after graduating, which has landed me back here in the Midwest in Indiana. So I'm currently an assistant professor at Ball State University. Briefly, before we kind of transition, I do want to emphasize I have some spots throughout where we'll chat and I'll just check in and ask if there's any questions. I'm very much so the person that likes to engage in ongoing discussions and Discord. So if you're like me and you know you're not going to remember a question, throw it in that chat box and I'll go ahead and make sure to constantly keep checking it. But I would love to hear sort of similarities or differences in experiences and other expertise that y'all have to offer. In that, I have been teaching since 2016. I have had amazing opportunities that have really kind of are wide ranging. I have been able to participate in autopsies. I worked at a juvenile treatment facility for individuals convicted of problematic sexual behaviors in Illinois. I worked at a crisis center for quite some time as a legal and medical advocate. Since moving here to Indiana, I have been a part of their sexual assault response team in Muncie. I've also been able to work as a skilled and expert witness for sexual assault and domestic violence cases. And then more recently, I have sort of taken on another hat or role at the university as a part-time Title IX investigator. And then more recently, over the summer, actually, I just completed facilitating a crisis intervention training for the Muncie Police Department, which was really fantastic and really well received. So that was a great experience. For my areas of expertise then, I'll sort of revolve around victimization as a whole. That's where my degree is. But where kind of my passion, I would say, really blossoms, which is kind of a weird analogy for the topic, but we're in like-minded audience here, so I know you understand, is that I really primarily look at system responses to sexual victimization. And this really just means looking at how our criminal legal system responds to sexual violence, specifically judges' decision-making, prosecutorial decision-making, arrest decisions, charge decisions. I would say over maybe the last couple of years, we've looked at specifically resource allocation and whether or not referrals are being given on calls and different things like that, which has been really interesting. But it also includes looking at society responses, so kind of how the general society interprets sexual violence. And then also university responses. So looking at experiences with Title IX, what does that look like? Why or why not do students engage with that process? I've also done research looking at help-seeking behaviors. That has been my most recent larger grant I'll get into in just a sec. And then again, individuals convicted of sexual offenses. I've done some research looking at predictors of recidivism for individuals on treatment. And that was really educational and very eye-opening. Some of my, I would say, most interesting kind of projects and research and discussions really came from that project while I was in school. It was really interesting. And then lastly, doing perceptions of Me Too movement work, as well as looking at sexual violence in academic settings, specifically looking at sexual violence that occurs at academic conferences, has been sort of an ongoing project that we are doing interviews for currently. It has been actually a lot more difficult than we anticipated. So that one's taking a bit longer, but still very, very interesting and needed, in my opinion, at least. Related to our grant, the grant projects that I've been able to work on, I worked on a federal grant project that was very extensive. We did a research and evaluation of, and I can't put the police department's name publicly, but I can say it was one of the fifth largest diverse metropolitan city in the United States. And we looked at their department's response to sexual assault and domestic violence specifically. And then I was also privileged enough to be chosen to work on a team that evaluated the prosecutorial's decision-making for domestic violence cases for Montgomery County. And that one also was really, really interesting and really helpful to see the implementation of a policy. We were looking at the before and after effects for them. And then lastly, I was awarded for my dissertation, ultimately how I graduated with my degree, but then also I continued this study into my career now. I'm just continuing to do interviews, just looking at individuals help-seeking decision-making across the United States. And so to kind of give you an overview of what to anticipate, I'll give you some context as to some of the data that I'll be referring to. So for that project of help seeking, that's what this first chunk is going to kind of be about, and I'll discuss. And then we'll talk about sort of some campus victimization themes that I was able to actually pull for this presentation. And then shift gears ever so slightly to talk about focal concerns or a newer project that me and my wonderful colleagues are currently working on, and then wrap up with what does this mean kind of moving forward or larger picture. Okay, so our overview, right? I don't need to sort of hammer in these statistics. I'm in like-minded audience, and so everyone is quite aware of the prevalence as well as sort of the ever ranging and scope that sexual violence has in our society, right? And so we know these statistics continue to come back pretty consistently, either differing from 1 in 4 undergraduate women experiencing some sort of sexual victimization to 1 in 5. I know every couple of years it fluctuates between the two statistics. And then we also know that for campuses specifically, right, this red zone that argues roughly right between August and it depends on what outlet we're looking at, but right, whether it be December or November, October-ish, kind of the highlighted chunk of the most at risk for experiencing sexual victimization on campuses, right? Through kind of shifting through the literature, we know through the National Victims Survey, as well as a Bureau rather of Justice Statistics, that just over 70% of survivors don't make a report to campus officials. And this may be something that I think a lot of us in this field can kind of anecdotally feel, in that, ever so often we'll hear people kind of in passing mention something, or it's sort of an off-cuff conversation. But for someone who now kind of works in Title IX when I can, it's interesting to see that I can anecdotally see, right, those maybe numbers not necessarily aligning up, just because of some of those barriers that we'll kind of get into today, as for why some individuals may not be using campus resources. And so for this first chunk, I was able to do 58 semi-structured interviews with individuals across the United States. Specifically, I was able to gather individuals across all geographic regions, which I thought for me is an amazing accomplishment. I think it really lends to being able to make stronger statements. Again, qualitative and quantitative data is a bit different, but I think with this data, we are able to get a lot of nuances and intricacies that we know exist within sexual violence. And so then to be able to capture that and do the best that I can to sort of display that is really interesting, I think. And so for this presentation, I went ahead and actually took out and filtered all the individuals who expressed experiencing victimization at a institution of higher education or at college. And so in total, 14 individuals gave some sort of disclosure about a victimization that happened on campus. And so I use a qualitative analysis program called Atlas TI. And so what I had done was I filtered that original sample, which was 58, and I filtered it for only those who experienced campus victimization, including those who did or did not report. I thought it was important to include both perspectives. And overall, I was able to kind of capture sort of four overarching themes. So these are not going to be necessarily broken down any further, just given sort of the time constraints, but I think they are warranting further conversation. And I'm really interested to see kind of your response, as well as your experience potentially with some of these things. And so overall, to give you some demographics on additional context on the sample that I'll be talking about. So at 58, 55 individuals gave their geographic location or region. We did have some missing data there, and that was just for some confidentiality and security concerns. I did not require participants to give me their location if that was something that was of a concern for them. And so we can see that the majority of individuals, interestingly, were from the South. Majority were between the ages of 20 to 29. Most of the sample was individuals who self-identify as being white, as opposed to, oh my, back it up, as opposed to our survivors who identified as being survivors of color. And then when we look at our sexual orientation, just over half of the sample did identify as being heterosexual. So just something to note is that a lot of the findings that I'll be discussing in just a second are going to be very reflective of what would be considered heteronormative sexual violence. And so that is sort of a larger limitation, and something that I want to be very transparent about, because we do know within the literature that sexual violence, specifically barriers to seeking help, and then adding another layer to that, seeking help on college campuses, is very unique and very different for individuals who identify in the LGBTQIA plus community compared to those who don't. And so just to be mindful of that as we were kind of running through these analyses. And then lastly, individuals were able to discuss as much as they wanted, as long as they had one experience of sexual violence that they we're going to discuss. I let them kind of go and talk about as much as they wanted. And so on average, individuals discussed about two sexual victimizations per person, with a total of 119 total victimization incidences that were included in this larger analyses. To give you guys kind of I guess a prelude to the rest of the findings, these were the four overarching themes that I thought that were really interesting. And the first being what was labeled as not serious enough. And so oftentimes within the sample of 14 individuals who were discussing campus victimization, individuals often would engage in some sort of minimization of their experience. And this was very much so followed by whether or not they were assessing if their victimization, their harm, their injuries, sort of insert here, was enough to sort of warrant formal intervention. So we really see a lot of outward minimization to essentially validate the decision to not seek for help. The next theme that we'll talk about, and I'll go into more detail, I give some quotes to further provide context, because I think those are really interesting. The next theme was did not want the criminal justice system involved. And this is a theme that actually commonly comes up, at least within my data as I've shifted through it and as we've worked through some projects. This is a common theme that we see regardless of individual race, regardless of the type of victimization. And so I thought this was interesting that it also presented for campus. And so specifically for did not want the criminal justice system involved, this very much so focused on the victim or complainant adamantly and explicitly stating that they did not want any sort of legal consequences, but instead rather have some sort of university response. The third the third theme is post-assault concerns. And this is where we sort of see individuals doing sort of a credibility assessment on themselves. And essentially individuals would hyperanalyze their behaviors post-assault and essentially indicate why those behaviors essentially discredited them from being able to seek for help. And then lastly, we have the informal medical help seeking. And this is one that I'm still disentangling and I think is really, really fascinating. We saw individuals sort of turning to medical services, but using covert motives. And so kind of get into what exactly does that look like and mean in just a second. So for the not serious enough theme, almost every individual who had experienced campus sexual victimization mentioned this theme to some degree, except for one. And so we can see that it's quite prevalent. We see that the minimization, right, of individuals sort of trying to fit their experience into a slew of arguably very restrictive kind of blueprints of what sexual assault is. And this is largely due to, in the literature, what we kind of refer to as these misperceptions of what is real rape. And I don't say that as a way to perpetuate the stigma, but rather to kind of provide some light to it. And so in the literature, we see evidence that society actually questions sexual assaults less if there are certain characteristics present. And we actually see this funneling into other systems as well. And so, for instance, if the sexual assault involved a stranger, if the individual actively fought back and had evidence of what we call gratuitous injuries, injuries that you can visually see, because we oftentimes know that sexual violence, there are internal injuries that we can't see. But if there's external that sort of is perceived to increase the credibility of their experience. And then lastly, if it was done in a sort of public place, and if there was a weapon involved, right? So all these kind of, you can see like evidentiary strengthening components. And so if a sexual assault occurs and it falls outside of sort of those characteristics, we oftentimes see this door open that really invites, unfortunately, sort of victim blaming, skepticism, and a lot of societal bias of these misperceptions of what we anticipate or expect sexual violence to look like. And so Moira, Lissy, and Lila, I think, really provides some examples about this, right? Moira saying, you know, it didn't happen in an alley. It kind of, again, getting at this idea that it has to be in a public place. It has to be really egregious. Lissy saying that, you know, there were other women that needed assistance or resources or that had experienced something that was worse than them. And so that's why they decided not to engage in any sort of formal reporting, which I think is really an interesting kind of conversation to have. And then lastly, Lila, you know, discussing how their perception, their understanding of what rape was, you know, again, falling within that really restrictive understanding that it has to be a stranger. And if it's a incident that occurs during a date, or if it was a first time meeting, right? That's when things get a little fuzzy. And that fuzziness is all individuals really need to start to essentially poke holes and assess maybe all the reasons why not to report. The second theme then was did not want the criminal justice system involved. And so 8 individuals out of the 14 mentioned this. And again, specifically, they did not want the suspect or their perpetrator to be arrested explicitly. Oftentimes, individuals would say that they didn't want their person to receive any sort of legal response, legal actions, but instead rather have had some sort of university intervention. And so Shay, Moira, and Cassandra, I think, do a really good job of kind of providing some context of what this looked like, Shay indicating that they didn't want to pursue legal action. They just didn't want to see them in their classes. She went on to explain that, right, essentially wanting to be able to work through the trauma of experiencing sexual victimization without the constant reminder of their perpetrator as they're trying to, you know, move through their degree. Moira then goes on to say that this individual did not report, and I had asked what would have been their preferred or ideal sort of response. And they did indicate that they rather had some sort of school-based intervention rather than it be handled through the justice system. So again, kind of getting at this preferred alternative intervention. And then lastly, Cassandra indicates, you know, I just didn't want him to go to prison. So we can kind of see this larger understanding of the gravity of the decision to report sexual victimization. And I think that's through a lot of discussions of within the media, right? Oftentimes we try to justify why individuals report by saying nobody wants to go through this, right? And I think to a degree that is a helpful statement, saying, you know, nobody wants to actively sort of welcome in all the skepticism. Nobody actively wants to be questioned and sort of, you know, disentangled and sort of torn apart. But I think in that we inadvertently then also sort of put really high stakes for good and for bad on the decision making. And so we'll get into in a bit, but I think I would like that to shift a little bit more as not necessarily being the responsibility of the victim, right? But again, how do we do that? And we can talk about that in a bit. The third theme then is post-assault concerns, and 5 individuals out of the 14 had mentioned this, so just about, or just at 35%. And this one was really interesting. I think this theme in particular really captured the essence of college. An individual, Cassandra, had indicated, I had to go to an interview. I'd deal with it later. And I thought that that was the most authentic response to someone who was coping with a very traumatic event, but also um, recognizing the realities, the harsh realities of life, right? This idea that Cassandra had to go to an interview. It wasn't just a job, it wasn't something you could call off. This was a scheduled potential opportunity. And she went on to indicate that I wasn't going to let this experience then take something else away from me. And I thought that was a really powerful, but also really interesting perspective, and one that I kept seeing come up, but in different forms. Another individual indicated for this particular theme, during their assault, they had their virginity taken from them. And right after they had experienced sexual victimization, they consensually decided to engage in sexual intercourse again. And Shay went on to indicate that they had done this as a way to take back control of their body. She said that it wasn't her decision the first time, and so out of spite, and I would even go as far as to maybe say I perceived to be a little bit of anger too. Shay wanted to engage in sexual intercourse on her terms, and so because of these behaviors, the examples given by Cassandra and Shay, individuals within this theme particularly said that they couldn't go and now report their victimization because their behaviors post-assault would come into question. They believed that their behaviors essentially reduced their credibility, and essentially weakened their case. And because of that, they did not want to open themselves up for potential additional victimization or pain through the process of reporting due to those behaviors. Something else really interesting was that an individual had said, for this particular theme, not only, I had to go to work, I couldn't call off, I didn't have days sick time to call off, was another one that an individual had said was the reason why they didn't go to HR. They just came to work the next day. So we can kind of see this theme translating beyond the campus, right? So to keep in mind for students who are not just working on campus, but also work off campus, and how that then kind of has reverberation and consequences beyond the campus. The last theme then within this particular conversation is informal medical help seeking. And I think this is really interesting, and one that not just on campuses, but for this particular presentation, I was able to isolate and find that 4 out of the 14 did engage in this particular behavior. And so I see I'd seen individuals discuss going and seeking medical care. And normally within the literature, we would sort of categorize that as formal help seeking, right? Going to a formal uh, agency to receive formal assistance, whether that be support, medical, financial, whatever. But these individuals were explicitly stating that they went to receive medical care because of their assault, but they were making their appointments explicitly with covert motives. And so what I mean by this is that individuals would either make an appointment at the student health center and say, I would like to make an appointment just to get an STI or STD check. through making an appointment. Oftentimes, individuals would say that they were asked if it was if they engaged in consensual or non-consensual sex. So there is sort of a filter question that was being asked, and individuals would explicitly talk to me about avoiding any of those conversations as much as possible. Rose mentioned going and getting her annual pap smear done. She had a really interesting conversation, and she said, I had been putting off my annual exam as one does. I would, she needed to make the appointment, I think she said she was about 4 months behind. Then this incident had happened, and she now all of a sudden felt this overwhelming need to get into an appointment as soon as possible to go ahead and get that annual pap smear. And so she said that it was very validating for her to be able to go through getting an annual procedure done. And then she asked for the results. And in the report, it did indicate that she had some tearing. The doctor had asked her about it. Again, she had said, whatever her excuse was, but explicitly being mindful to not disclose any victimization or essentially anything that would trigger sort of that mandatory reporting. So I think something that's really interesting is that individuals are sort of, we see conversations on whether or not people have finances to go, or whether or not there's this conversation about barriers with insurance. And to be quite honest, I thought that that was going to be the theme that came with sort of, all the flashing lights, but it wasn't necessarily the component of, I didn't have insurance, or the lack of knowledge on, sexual assault kits being confidential or supposed to, right? But it was more so around this idea that individuals are taking control over their decision making. In a way that has them feel like they have power, is sort of my analysis from this. And I think that that's really important, and something that for future discussions, something that I think practitioners, researchers, experts, all of us in this field, I think we can really lean into this. Now, before I continue blabbling along, I want to just go ahead and check in. Does anyone have questions just over that kind of first chunk? Let me see if I can pull up the chat just in case. First chunk of information.
Brittany, while we're waiting for folks to put things in the chat or to unmute themselves and ask questions if they have them, I have a question for you. I'm kind of curious about that huge chunk of students who reported that they didn't feel like their their incident of sexual violence was significant enough to warrant really engaging in that process. And I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts about like where those ideas of what is significant enough kind of come from. Like, do you think that they come from society? Do you think they come from like movies? Do you think they come from kind of what folks are getting from their friends or at schools, or kind of where is that coming from? Because that's a really large portion of respondents who said, like, I don't think that my traumatic, violent experience was significant enough.
Yeah, that's a great question. We have this conversation all the time, and like I said, this theme wasn't just the not serious enough, wasn't just prevalent for campus. This is a theme that is constantly showing itself, no matter sort of the parameters that I put on the sample. So I think that that is a testament, one, to how salient and impactful the theme is for these individuals who are experiencing sexual violence. Now, where do I think it's coming from? That's hard. From the people that I have talked to, I think it's sort of a mixture of a lot of things. Definitely, I think societal misperceptions, although I would argue that we're making progress, although it seems like little baby steps, which often includes sort of like a stumbling backwards and then a stumbling forwards. I think we're making slow progress, but I do still think that it is some societal misperceptions, and then that is unfortunately sort of fueled by kind of this rape culture idea, right? These these expectations of sort of, sexual victimization is supposed to be this monolithic experience, meaning everyone is supposed to experience it this particular way, and if you deviate ever so slightly from that path, it's sort of like this, well, is that what you experienced? Is that true? Right. It sort of almost opens up for that those questionings. Um, and I think individuals then do this internalized questioning themselves, almost as a way to sort of cope and prepare. So it's almost like individuals are assessing their own victimization while also we're forgetting processing it at the same time. Right. And so that's really difficult to have two higher level kind of cognitive processes happening at the same time. You're trying to go through and process what just happened to you. It was quite traumatic. Um, some people have different responses to it, right? Some people are like, oh, it wasn't as bad as XYZ because they have different victimization experiences. I've seen people kind of put it in a hierarchy. Whereas other people, let's say it completely, sort of rocks their world. So even just our responses, right, to victimization, even if those deviate ever so slightly from what we sort of expect, um, we see those questionings. And so I hear individuals sort of, I like almost witness them doing it in real time as though they're like walking through their victimization, they're walking through their experience, they're walking through how they responded and interacted and behaved. And then I see them kind of drawing the conclusion of, well, that's why. And so they're almost poking holes in their own case, if you will. Yeah, like I said, it's kind of in a coping manner. But I would also say in that same conversation, oftentimes this not serious enough theme is very so tied to expectations of our criminal justice system. Um, which I think is a larger conversation because I think historically and arguably, depending where you're at currently, sexual assault cases are prosecuted in a very particular way. Unfortunately, there's a lot of barriers. Sexual assault, this is a crime where the individual is the crime scene. Their body is the crime scene. That's not the case for, a home invasion. That's not the case for, a theft, right? And so there's different nuances that I think make it difficult, rightfully so. But we see victims being very, very aware of this. They're aware of the mandatory reporting, right? They don't know who is, but it's just sort of this blanket caution. And then the same thing with our criminal justice system. They sort of know that maybe not as many cases are as discussed, or maybe are perceived to end in a manner that is justice. And so that then also sort of serves as a almost like a pause button. But yeah, it's a great question and one I think we could talk about all day, honestly.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. That's just such a kind of a startling statistic. So thank you for that. Emily put into the chat, the bar is set so low in our culture for how victims, parentheses, women should be treated that we expect to be assaulted at some point.
Yeah. And I think it even starts, if you think about campus resources, I see, self-defense, right? This idea that you are going to experience it, so be prepared. And while I think having resources in your toolbox is great, I think I would like the conversation maybe to be shifted ever so slightly to not necessarily, have all women sort of trained to be black belts out there, although that's fantastic and I'm here for that. I think we need to sort of maybe encourage a more critical conversation, right? On acceptable behavior. And even at our current university, we were sort of chatting about that, about how can we change this conversation about consent and healthy sex, right? At the end of the day, people are going to engage in what they want to engage in. Don't you want it to be enjoyable? You don't want this horrible situation to be the case. So let's be adults and kind of talk about it, right? But yeah, absolutely. Let's go ahead. Um, there are no other questions. And again, we can chat at the end as well. Let me share. Okay, wonderful. There we go. Okay. So this next sort of chunk is about this newer rather, study that me and my wonderful colleagues, I have a wonderful colleague, Alondra Garza in Houston, Christy Gullion, she is in Texas as well, and the place is escaping me, but she's in northern Texas. And then Kat Meeker or Catherine Meeker, who is also a part of our project. And so just to give them credit where credit is due, they're my wonderful colleagues that have been helping me through this. And so we are currently applying what is known as a focal concerns framework to this data that I kind of just chatted with you about. And so to give you some context, what is focal concerns? For the literature and the research that we have, oftentimes when I had mentioned, I look at systems responses, specifically criminal justice responses. There's a lot of questions related to, well, how do our judges make their decisions? Or how do our prosecutors come up with a decision to exclude or include certain bits of evidence, who to call as expert testimony if they can, if they have the resources to. And so through a lot of prolific individuals before my time, and a lot of hard work, they were able to really kind of funnel it down to what is known as focal concerns. And essentially, this has been used to justify or interpret, rather, judges' decision making for sentencing defendants. And so within this theoretical framework, the researchers have kind of organized three main areas of concern that judges really focus on. The one being blameworthiness. So how culpable is this individual? What harm did they cause? The second then concern that they're going to weigh is going to be the protection to the community, which is really kind of the crux of their job. Oftentimes, a lot of judge training materials is very much so centered on this protecting the community, protecting for future, right? And so what risk does this person pose to others, others being victims? And then the last one is practical constraints and consequences. And this is going to look at what are the real world barriers, costs, or unintended consequences that can come from this case, this individual, whether it be sentenced or not. And so with this in mind, we were saying, judges obviously go through a thought process. And as we're shifting through this data, I had this conversation with them and say, I don't think, individuals who experience victimization are that different from our judges who are kind of doing this internal, almost like risk versus benefits analysis. We very much so hear survivors and victims talk about weighing costs and benefits all the time. It's just in different language, right, that fits the scenario. And so instead of assessing blameworthiness of how culpable an individual is, maybe a victim or a survivor, however they identify, maybe they are assessing blameworthiness of themselves, right? Given our literature to justify, right, these prior themes of not being serious enough, this internalizing perceptions or expectations of what is considered real rape. Maybe it looks a little different, right? And so we essentially took these three theoretical focal concerns, and we said, okay, we're going to look at what does this look like for our victims. And so this isn't to be entirely transparent. This is based off of our the entire sample, so not just those who experienced campus sexual victimization, but those who experienced sexual victimization in general. We saw that this focal concerns of what judges would be assessing for blameworthiness, we're seeing that victims are actually doing the exact same thing. They are assessing blameworthiness, but they're assessing it in sort of three different components. We see the first being internalized victim blaming. And so we see individuals engaging in their own victim blaming. This is going to look like, and I have my example quotes over here just so I can make sure to pull them for you. But essentially, internal victim blaming, we have, I went over there willingly. So this idea of the location of where their victimization occurred, again, being considered. So, like we had just chatted about with real rape, this idea that it has to be in a public place. We're seeing this sort of manifest, but in very sort of a niche way. So not only is sort of this individual mentioning that it didn't happen in a public place, but the fact that they weren't necessarily forced or coerced or any sort of extra physical sort of placing of the individual there. The victim went over there willingly, and therefore that's why this internal victim blaming, this blameworthiness started to sort of infuse in their decision making. We also saw individuals say that, I went to his room alone. Specifically for, I know this quote for campus was related to going to a fraternity person's dorm, and that being sort of their justification as to sort of why they didn't have as much credibility in their case. And then for rape culture, we see individuals within this theme essentially sharing a belief that they did not, their incident did not constitute as rape. They didn't identify their circumstance or experience as rape because there was an absence of physical violence specifically. And so for context, individuals would say, well, he didn't hit me. I just froze and let whatever happened happen. So this idea that, our trauma responses now are being used as evidence to discredit victims, as opposed to being evidence to empower or evidence to understand behaviors. That's a sort of separate conversation we can go into, right? But these trauma responses of fight, flight, freeze, or at least the most common three. We know that there's others like fawning and flopping, but we know that freezing, I believe the statistic is like 88% of victims who experience sexual victimization freeze. That is a significant factor that I think should be used, as opposed to discredit, should be used to support, or rather empower, or be used as a reason to report, right? As opposed to not. But I still think that that's really interesting to sort of see that inverse relationship for victims. Another individual said, he didn't necessarily penetrate me. And so because of that, because of the lack of what they assumed to be the sort of the last behavior to qualify them as a individual who's experienced rape, that's why they didn't perceive their instance to be sexual victimization. So I think that's also really, really interesting. For internalized victim credibility, essentially individuals were making sort of evaluations based on their risky behaviors. So this is going to be very similar to the theme that we just mentioned about the post-assault behaviors. Um, we see this within the full sample. So we see this whether individuals are experiencing it on campus or off. And so specifically, an individual not only is going to start to evaluate their behaviors, but they're really kind of picking apart themselves as human beings, which is really unfortunate. One individual had mentioned that they have nudes that they thought would be brought into question if either at the Title IX hearing or would be brought into question in court. Another individual indicated, they have tattoos. They didn't believe that they would be perceived as being credible because of that. Other individuals had said that, they had a history of sort of using and abusing drugs. And so because of that, they believe that their statement would then already be met with sort of a level of skepticism that somebody who maybe didn't have a history of drug abuse would. For the protect the community theme, this was really interesting and one that I think we often hear, but it was really interesting to see it surface in a numeric form. And so individuals often would say, if they did engage in reporting, the reason why they did report was because of this obligation or this larger feeling of responsibility to do their due diligence in an attempt to prevent future victimization from that perpetrator. And so I thought that was really interesting. Essentially, individuals would say it makes me sick to my stomach to think about however many other victims may have been impacted by this individual. Some other individuals had said, I if other victims had come forward and disclosed that they had been victimized by this person, that they would also. So again, this idea that there's sort of the power in numbers, whether it be numbers in those with similar experiences from the same perpetrator, or if it's individuals who are trying to prevent similar experiences from that perpetrator for others. So that was a really interesting sort of position that victims often would put themselves in as they were reflecting on whether or not they were happy with their decision to report, if they wish they would have reported, and sort of that line of conversation. We saw this appear quite often. For the last one then, regarding practical constraints, I think this is where a conversation can be had for a lot of improvement at a logistical, I guess, point of view. And so for practical constraints, these are essentially individuals just outlining like the reasons why it's difficult to report. And I think at the end of the day, these are the things that other practitioners who are working in these spheres, I think these are the things that we can kind of sink our teeth in trying to make it better. And so for the first one was individuals overwhelmingly had mentioned sort of this fear of the legal system, this idea that they either had personal fear because of past interactions with the police. Oftentimes individuals would say, I lived in domestic violence. I have had interactions with the police previously. They actually were not helpful. They actually did more damage than good. And although domestic violence does have a lot of similarities to sexual violence, and they overlap quite a bit. There are uniquely differences, right? And especially how we respond. And so it's unfortunate that one interaction can then entirely negate an individual from receiving resources, support, um, everything that they should be receiving um, for a very traumatic event, right? And so I think it also kind of highlights the importance of every interaction, and we have those conversations, within my community all the time, as how to make those first impressions, even if you don't know, right? Even they may have seen you last week. You've seen many people you don't really remember, but making sure that every interaction is as positive as we can possibly make it. All right. For the financial and logistical burdens, this one's really interesting and kind of got to that other thing we had briefly mentioned, but this idea that, um, you know, I, I have to go to work still. I can't just take off. Um, I just can't take off a full day. We know that sexual assault examinations can take quite a bit. They can take hours. Before you even get an examination, you could be waiting for hours, right? And so let's say this happens at night and now you're up all night waiting for an exam and then conducting an exam. And then next thing you know, it's, 3 or 4 in the morning. You have to get up to go to work at 7 in the morning. That is a lot, right? That's a lot to, again, as you're trying to process what is going on. Humans are amazing in that we are able to sort of uh, decompartmentalize, but only for a little bit, right? We try to prioritize, but we sort of the dumpster fires that we need to attack or address right away. But then that doesn't put out that, that smoke and that fire in the back. It eventually kind of consumes people. And it is cyclical. We see it happening. Um, but not only a financial burden, we also see logistical in terms of individuals expressing that they know that HR is not for them. Individuals quite often will say, my boss, did X, Y, and Z. Sure, there's an anonymous reporting, but my friend did this anonymous reporting and, she was fired or there was some sort of retaliation, right? And so I think that also kind of exposes some interesting conversations that could be had at the, in terms of victimization at the workplace. The last one then is secondary victimization. This is a larger conversation we are pretty familiar with, in that individuals just didn't want, they expected questions, they expected the questions to be rude, or they expected some sort of hostility within the communication that they ultimately anticipated having to have with either police officer, a medical personnel, a Title IX officer, etc. Right. So a lot of individuals just said it's not worth it. And then lastly, we saw individuals discuss this delayed reporting and emotional suppression, which we sort of coined, in that oftentimes individuals will say, I didn't think it was sexual assault. I didn't think it was rape until, maybe my senior year, or maybe until, this happened my freshman year, and maybe not until my sophomore year when I had this particular class and we had a conversation, or an example was used that was very similar to an experience I had had. Oftentimes we see individuals kind of engaging in this delayed process where they have immediate things that they need to address first. And I think this is very applicable to that conversation about campus victimization. Our students have so many things that they're juggling. Us as adults have so much that we are juggling, right? And so in the immediate, a way to cope is very much so seen within just keep going. And if you think about kind of a larger conversation within society, we have that mentality, right? The grind, get a side hustle, keep going. That mentality, although can be helpful, I think sometimes then gets used as a way to help individuals kind of cope through things. We know a trauma response, very much so, is if individuals experience victimizations, traumatic sexual victimization. Um, One of the common responses is to throw themselves into work, to take on more projects than they ever have before, um, to maybe lead a presentation that maybe they've never led, they're not known for leading presentations, um, doing anything that they can to sort of keep their mind busy elsewhere. And because of this, we then see once an individual is ready to do some disentangling. Oftentimes we see that either so much time has lapsed that victims then sort of interpret that as being a barrier, discrediting their disclosure, discrediting the seriousness. Oftentimes individuals will say, well, if if I was that if I was that impacted, then why didn't I report, that night? Or why didn't I go to the hospital, in a couple of days? Or I didn't do any of those things. And so it wasn't as serious. And so we see that kind of conversation breakdown as well, which I think is really interesting. Again, we're seeing victims do almost a evidentiary assessment as if they're their own kind of lawyer before even oftentimes before even interacting with the police or any sort of formal official in the first place. And so when we talk about larger conversations and what does this mean, I think we have a lot to do in terms of our first interactions with individuals. So we know that individuals are sort of coming to us. If they are, we know that the likelihood of them even engaging with formal systems in the first place is extremely difficult. They have to overcome a slew of barriers, and that depends on the individual. But also, they have all these societal expectations of how we respond to sexual victimization. And so I really do think that if we kind of rewire how we are approaching situations, to almost assume that the person in front of us, we need to sort of show them that it's safe. I mean, at the most basic kind of strategy, right? This idea that all of those misperceptions that you anticipate from me, I want to not necessarily prove them wrong, but I want to show them that there is a different experience, right? And so it's easier said than done, especially when I talk to our advocates that work in our law enforcement agencies. Oftentimes, they're getting individuals that are not very happy. They're at like the worst point in their lives. But as one of the sort of advocates at Ball State always says, and I think it's just one of the most amazing quotes. And I think she's here today, so I'll give her a little shout out, Miss Anna McGee. She, always says that it's one of the most rewarding things is to be the most positive point in someone's worst phase of their life, right? And so if that's just kind of like the end goal, that's really where I try to kind of ground myself in any sort of interactions. I threw a lot at you, and I'm still hoping to kind of have some conversations after this. But in terms of moving forward, I think we've done over the last couple of years a really good job of sort of making the term trauma informed practices, trauma informed techniques and strategies a more common used word. I don't think it has as much sort of taboo attached to it as it maybe did before. When it was originally proposed, right, this idea of explicitly having trauma informed interview techniques, trauma informed approaches to interviewing and responding, to referring services. There was a lot of I would say, pushback, because if individuals were seen as implementing trauma informed XYZ, it was essentially that agency's way of kind of like telling on themselves. It was seen or interpreted as, oh, well, you weren't doing a good job before, and so now we have this explicit, technique being implemented. I think over the years we've really worked hard to break down that stigma, that not necessarily, that's not the truth, right? We're not saying that those who are implementing it now weren't before, or that there were issues, but more so that we recognize the importance of it, and that not only the importance of it, but we recognize sort of the outcomes of it, right? We have research to support that with trauma informed techniques, interviewing styles, communication, that it actually does increase victim cooperation. And so, 70% aren't reporting to the police. That 30% is really important to try and keep as protected and safe and supported as much as possible, so that we can see those cases sort of move through, and go through the process. I would like, now that we have, I would say, a more normalized uh, relationship with trauma informed technique, I would really like to see this transition to trauma informed policies. Oftentimes, there's this sort of lull of, we have a bunch of research to suggest, you know, predictors of behavior, or, consequences, side effects. And then there seems to be quite a gap in time in which we can actually implement sort of proactive policies, or procedures. And so I would like, as we're continuing to move through the sphere, I would like to start to use trauma informed policies, that uses research based evidence to support, maybe why it's, this case is being processed a little bit differently, because of X, Y, and Z, supported by research. So I know that there are legality issues to that, or at least conversations surrounding that. But I think as we continue to have them, I think, or I at least hope, that's kind of where we can resolve a lot of these expectations, these strict confines of how we're processing sexual violence currently. Because again, as we all know, I have yet to hear the same experience twice. I have talked to almost 100 people now who have experienced sexual victimization, and I haven't heard the same story. And so I think justifying our legal responses, or our policy responses to sexual victimization to then fit that reality, I think there could be a lot of progress made there. And then that's really all I have. But I would love to, like I said, just kind of open it up and hear conversations, interactions, experiences that other people have had or are currently going through. Yeah. Can anyone speak to maybe any of the themes that I had mentioned today? Are these common behaviors, responses that y'all are experiencing? Or is there some that maybe you're experiencing that haven't been discussed? I would love to maybe hear some of those, put on my radar even.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Hi. Okay, so some of the things, without going into too much detail, arises when we have like at the university level, we have a reporting. So one concern is that there's legal issues that arise on the university end. So that can impede our prosecution sometimes for a bit. The other thing is I'm really concerned about what kind of support the victims are getting at the university level. So if they're reporting to the university or there's reporting to the police, one of the things that you talked about really struck me was that when the victims try to minimize and kind of talk through the crime and talk themselves out of it, and there's nobody really there to kind of support and acknowledge, their instinct on what happened, and that there might be people on that end that are hearing this and hoping that that's what they're going to do. So that's a concern as well. So I guess one of my questions would be, how can we better navigate in a protocol that's trauma informed with the universities and also the schools at their level? They have a way of doing things as well with the high schools.
Sure. So I can speak to kind of my experience and something that I think is working well for my little community, at least. That this may seem so juvenile, but having an open line of communication, and that also it can be so simple, but yet so difficult when you have several different actors involved, right? So if you have your investigator, your police officers, you have your Title IX coordinators, your investigators. It can be really difficult to get everyone to sit down, but I think that that's one of the most beneficial things that we can do. And so currently, we have monthly meetings where we do actually invite the high school, surrounding high schools to come and talk with us who are also involved in responding to Title IX. And we talk about, current obstacles that we're facing, whether that be we've seen, an increase in individuals bringing attorneys to their cases. And so, how are we, let's make sure we're all in consensus of how to respectfully navigate that. But I think one of the things that's popping into my head as being one of the most, I would say, beneficial was that we were, talking, and I had chatted with some of the monthly police officers, and one of them had said, I never thought we were talking about how to restructure maybe some of these interview questions. And one of the questions I said, instead of asking, why didn't you leave or why didn't you report? I said, I hear what you're saying, right? I get what you're saying. But from a individual's perspective who has just experienced this, who has a increased level of cortisol, that is, hormone that is flooding through their body, that is essentially to survive, right? They're still in survival mode. That question can be quite either triggering or can entirely shut down a person. And so instead of using those words, maybe instead saying, what made it difficult, right? Instead of why, saying what made it difficult acknowledges that that officer knows that it's difficult and that he or she is interested in understanding it from their perspective, right? It doesn't show bias. It doesn't show that they're taking one side or the other, speaking legality, but it does show that they understand the complex nature of the potential victimization that may have occurred that they're investigating, right? And so I think that one example was something that I was like, oh, okay, that's really interesting. Giving concrete examples, walking through, how we can talk through and ask these questions that we know we have to include in an investigative report or in any sort of, official document. We chatted about, oftentimes I will talk to both my both party or all parties involved, and I'll say, hey, I'm going to ask some questions, and I know at first they're not going to seem great, and I'm really sorry for that. I try to be as transparent, and to be try to be as human as possible, right? At the end of the day, we're all humans, and talking about sex with a professor or an investigator may be a little uncomfortable, right? These are very intimate moments of which we're not consensual. So to kind of meet them at a humane level and just say, hey, I know this is really uncomfortable and I'm sorry. I rather ask you this now, or I'm gonna, work through these questions now. Just know that these are not me judging. This is not how I feel. These are just questions that I want to make sure you have the ability to provide an answer to. So that way, when you are in front of a board, they aren't asking you this, out of the blue. And maybe it's hopefully it's a little safer, or you feel a little more comfortable talking it with, here, just with me. I really just try to kind of be as human as possible. Now, related to the other part that you had said, maybe they hear things and they hear people talk out of reporting. Yeah, that one's difficult. I'm not going to deny that may or may not happen, because that could very well be the reality for some. Um, I don't have a solution for that one. I think making sure that we get the good ones in terms of our officers and really trying to invest in um, kind of making them like the ultimate super responder, really. I mean, I think about our police chief here who, is in charge of our interviewing, and I can't say enough amazing things about him. And so I just talked to someone the other day. I wish I could just copy and paste, a whole bunch of him. But as long as we can continue to maybe get like-minded, it's not going to be an overnight fix. But I won't sit here and deny that potentially doesn't happen, because we see it sometimes, right? But yeah, hopefully I answered some bit of your question. I'm known for going on tangents, so apologize in
Yeah, no,
advance.
no, I appreciate it. And then we have really great university police, but in general, there are situations where I see like maybe a young person who may have like gone through that minimizing and things of that nature, and I just feel like they need more support on the university level, maybe like advocates there as well. So
So we do have at my university, we have a victims d- department center, and they are really kind of they get called to cases, and they really are kind of their confidential support person. They do a really good job of interacting with our individuals. I will say that is not, out of the two other universities I've been at, that is not common. This was the first university that I've been at that has had a designated sort of department or in-house advocacy center. Now, with that, there is only one person, and so she is quite often very busy. But I get, one is better than none type of a deal, and so you're just trying to work to support that person as much as possible. But yeah, I think if you can just somehow structure to have regular open meetings of just constant conversation, you'll start to see maybe where those gaps are. I mean, we found that, uh, we have a sexual assault response team at the prosecutor's office. We constantly get flyers from them, from, the Office of Violence Against Women and whatever other resources that they're using. And we're like, yeah, print a million of them, give them to us. So that way we can just, hand out stuff left and right. I know our victim center has, or I keep saying victim center, but they have a bunch of resources. And so I think making sure that you can have an open line of communication, but then having some sort of, I don't know if policy or procedure is the right word, but essentially if there is a call, to then have a system in place to then be able to have somebody else come. I know we have people on call constantly, with the hope that whenever there is an incident, that there's always going to be some sort of advocate with them.